a grand piano, an arrogant millionaire, and a servant. The moment that began as a cruel attempt to humiliate her evolved into a moment that fractured egos and silenced the room. You will be astounded by the extent to which she utilized her talent to transform the situation. The Air at La Fontaine, an upscale restaurant located in the center of Raleigh, North Carolina, was filled with a hum of conversations on a warm Friday evening. The ambience of refined indulgence was established by the gentle footsteps of servers, the clinking of glasses, and the faint strains of jazz emanating from a corner piano. Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress with a quiet demeanor and an unmistakable spark in her irises, moved quickly between tables, balancing plates and smiles. In the eyes of the majority of patrons, she was merely another uniformed individual. However, she harbored aspirations that exceeded the lavish dining room that enveloped her. Deborah's passion was not for serving tables, it was for music. The piano had been her sanctuary since childhood, a space where she could articulate every unspoken thought, every pleasure, and every sorrow. However, aspirations are not sufficient to cover expenses. A stepping stone towards the music academy she aspired to attend, working lengthy shifts at La Fontaine was a necessity. Except for the restaurant staff, who occasionally observed her stealing moments at the ancient upright piano in the back room during breaks, few were aware of her talent. Leonard Grayson entered the room as the evening bustle began to subside. The affluent entrepreneur made an entrance that was immediately identifiable, as if he possessed the room. Leonard emanated an aura of superiority, surrounded by a handful of equally refined associates. Deborah's colleagues exchanged knowing glances as he was recognized for his sharp tongue and propensity for spectacle, which caused even the most seasoned staff to stand. Leonard was a difficult guest to accommodate. He was the type of individual who derived pleasure from provoking others. However, for Deborah, he was merely an additional table to oversee during a lengthy evening of work. However, this was not going to be a typical evening. Deborah was the object of Leonard's attention as he surveyed the room. He appeared to be intrigued by something about her, which resulted in a brief pause and a grimace. Deborah felt the weight of his gaze, but she dismissed it, instead concentrating on the task of refilling water glasses and clearing platters. However, Leonard was not yet finished with her. He had already determined that she would serve as his entertainment for the evening. Deborah had been raised in a small town in South Carolina, where the notion of splendor was frequently as distant as the stars. Deborah's mother, a single mother and a diligent carer, had worked double shifts as a nurse to guarantee that Deborah and her siblings had food on the table. Music had always been a consistent presence in their household, despite their modest financial resources. The seeds of Deborah's passion for melody were planted by her mother's antiquated vinyl recordings and the piano that was gifted to her by a neighbor. Her refuge was that piano. Deborah spent hours instructing herself on how to play while other children played outside. She began by imitating the melodies of the radio stations and subsequently expanded her repertoire to include classical compositions that she discovered in second-hand music books. Her abilities were not overlooked. She performed at community events, school recitals, and church services. However, her successes were obscured by the financial obstacles that threatened her aspirations. She realized that a professional music career would have to be postponed by the time she reached the age of 18. Scholarships were not awarded, and family obligations took precedence. Deborah abandoned her concert aspirations in favor of the practicality of earning a livelihood. However, she was unable to completely relinquish the piano. It was more than just a fantasy, it was a part of her identity. Deborah pursued employment at La Fontaine when she relocated to Raleigh several years ago, not only for the compensation but also for the grand piano that was concealed in the restaurant's corner. Despite the fact that she had limited time to enjoy it, the mere fact that it was present provided her with a sense of solace. Music was not absent from her, it was merely awaiting her. In the evening, as Leonard and his companion sat down, Deborah approached their table, expertly balancing a tray. Leonard ordered a premium scotch and cracked a jest that was audible to the tables in the vicinity. Deborah accepted their orders with a polite smile, her voice remaining stable in spite of the peculiar energy emanating from him. Leonard glanced at Deborah's name badge and asked, "Deborah, huh? Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents." She was taken aback by the remark, but she politely nodded and proceeded to place their orders. The knowing look he shared with his companion and the way his eyes followed her every move were not noticed by her. However, Leonard was not merely observing, he was also devising a strategy. Deborah would soon find herself at the epicenter of a spectacle that she had never requested. The room was filled with the hum of merriment and cutlery as the night continued as it always did. Deborah maintained a consistent cadence as she navigated between tables, evading Leonard's gaze. She had previously encountered challenging consumers, however, There was something distinct about him that was not only calculated but also rude. He loomed over her like a shadow, causing her to feel uneasy in a manner that she was unable to shake. Leonard had already begun his performance by the time the appetizers were served. Although it was not the type of performance Deborah had anticipated, he maintained his position at his table, noisily recounting stories of his success and interjecting sarcastic remarks about individuals who lacked ambition. While other diners directed irritated glances towards him, his entourage laughed obediently. Leonard caught Deborah off guard as she returned to his table with a bottle of wine, despite her efforts to remain focused on her responsibilities. He demanded, "Deborah, tell me," his voice piercing the din. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." She was halted in mid-step by his words. Deborah hesitated before providing a thoughtful response. She gently stated, "I occasionally play the piano, with the intention of maintaining brevity." Leonard's irises shone with a sly smile, and he widened his eyes. "A pianist, huh? How fascinating. Why don't you give us a little performance?" Deborah's body remained frozen. The room was eerily silent, as if the weight of his words were suspended in the air. "Oh, I was unable to," she replied abruptly, suppressing an anxious chuckle. "I'm just here to work tonight." However, Leonard was unwilling to relinquish it. He declared, his voice resounding, "Nonsense. There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." His companions laughed, evidently enjoying the performance. Other patrons, intrigued by the disturbance, turned their heads. Deborah's thorax contracted. She could sense the heat emanating from their gazes, the silent judgment that was about to be revealed. Leonard's challenge hanged in the air, challenging her to either rise to it or crumble under its weight. She wanted to say no, to walk away. "I really shouldn't," Deborah faltered, casting a glance around for assistance. However, her counterparts appeared to be hesitant to take action. Leonard reclined in his chair and smirked as he sipped his scotch. "Ah, I see," he joked. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The words struck like a blow. Deborah's fists were clenched at her sides. She was not inclined to pursue confrontation, however, the manner in which he dismissed her, as if she were a jest or an insignificant individual, was more profound than she had anticipated. Her mother's voice reverberated in her consciousness. "Deborah, do not allow anyone to diminish your size. They will never comprehend your magnitude." A brief period of silence ensued between them. Deborah briefly observed Leonard before returning her attention to the piano. His arrogant demeanor encouraged her to succumb to the temptation. She did so, despite her better judgment. Her voice was steady but subdued as she said, "Fine. I'll play." Deborah approached the piano with a sense of anticipation, each stride laden with both dread and defiance. The room was alive with anticipation. As she approached the glistening grand piano, the dining room appeared to be in a state of awe. She was isolated from the murmuring throng by the soft glow of the chandelier above, which cast a spotlight on her. The polished keys gleamed like a challenge waiting to be met as she slid onto the bench, causing her fingertips to tremble. Leonard, who was seated behind her, sat back in his chair with an arrogant expression of satisfaction, as if he had already won the game he was playing. Deborah briefly closed her eyes to regulate her breathing. She was unable to concentrate due to the intense pounding of her pulse. This was not the church recital or the intimate community gatherings that she had previously experienced. This was distinct. This was antagonistic. However, it was impossible to reverse the situation at this point. She placed her hands on the keys, allowing her fingertips to feel the cold surface beneath them. Initial notes were delicate, hesitant, and almost fragile. A few patrons shifted in their seats, and a cough was heard in the rear of the room. Deborah's concentration was heightened as she leant into the music, and she disregarded them. The piece she selected was a soulful rendition of Clair de Lune by Debussy, which she knew by heart. The melody permeated the space, ebbing and flowing through the atmosphere like a delicate yet resolute thread. The music intensified as her self-assurance increased. The notes spilt out like a confession, and her hands moved with a grace that belied the pandemonium within her. The weight of dreams deferred but never abandoned, the sacrifices her mother made, the nights she spent practicing in a cramped room, and each chord seemed to convey a piece of her story. The diners ceased to converse, and their previous conversation was substituted by a collective silence. Leonard, who had been conversing with his companions in a murmur, also ceased to speak. Deborah was not required to observe him in order to perceive the transformation in the room. The mocking energy had dissipated, substituted by an energy that she was unable to identify, possibly humility or astonishment. Deborah relinquished her inhibitions for the first time in what seemed like years as the music soars. She was an artist, not a waitress or a struggling idealist, she was simply herself. Her fingers danced across the keys, eliciting emotions that appeared to linger in the air like smoke, as if they were raw and vibrant. The room was completely silent by the time she struck the final chord. The piano's lingering resonance was the sole sound for a brief period. Deborah remained seated, her hands still resting on the keys, uncertain about the next steps. Then, the audience erupted into acclaim, as if they had been liberated from a spell. The room was filled with a warmth that Deborah had not anticipated, as the thunderous sound reverberated off the walls. She was moved to tears by the fervor with which some patrons stood and clapped. Her colleagues, who had been observing from the sidelines, joined in, their expressions beaming with pride. Leonard, on the other hand, maintained his position. Deborah was unable to ascertain the nature of his expression, which was a combination of astonishment and discomfort, as his smirk had vanished. He slowly elevated his hands and clapped, producing a hollow sound in contrast to the cheers that surrounded him. However, his hesitant ovation was insufficient to obscure the actions that Deborah had just taken. She had regained her voice, and no amount of condescension could stifle it. The room seemed to collectively exhale as the applause began to diminish. Deborah's back was erect, but her knees continued to tremble as she slowly stood. She turned her head, and for the first time that evening, she could actually see the individuals who were watching her, not as spectators, but as witnesses. Their facial expressions conveyed a novel combination of respect, admiration, and a slight sense of astonishment. She refrained from inspecting Leonard immediately. Her lips curled into a faint smile as she gave a small, polite nod to the diners who had applauded the loudest. She did not experience pride, rather, she felt relief that she had not succumbed to dread. However, her attention abruptly shifted to Leonard, as if she were being drawn to him. He was still seated, with his hands joined in front of him on the table. The self-assured grin that he had previously displayed with such bravado was absent. Rather, his visage was a facade of coerced neutrality, as if he were unable to determine whether to acknowledge his error or maintain his arrogance. Leonard eventually broke the fragile silence that had settled over the room by saying, "Well," his voice a bit too loud. "That was unexpected," he laughed lightly, although it was devoid of his customary confidence. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places." The comment was received with a muted thud. Companions exchanged awkward glances, uncertain whether to chuckle or remain silent. Deborah's head was slightly inclined as she examined him. His words were intended to serve as an olive branch, however, they were false, as they were burdened by his inability to truly own the moment. Deborah expressed her gratitude with a deliberate and composed demeanor. Her voice was devoid of tenderness, but it was also devoid of hostility. She was determined not to allow him to relegate her to the diminutiveness he had endeavored to establish. She was unable to provide a rebuttal that was as powerful as her performance. Leonard's larynx cleared, evidently uneasy under the collective gaze of the room. He made a feeble attempt to reclaim his composure by gesturing towards the waiter for an additional beverage. "You possess an extraordinary talent," he concluded, with a hint of reluctance. Deborah's focus remained unwavering as she nodded once. "Each individual possesses a talent," she declared, her tone deliberate. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The air was tinged with the subtle sting of her response, and the room appeared to be holding its breath once more. It was not overly boisterous or aggressive, however, it was sufficient. Leonard's usual air of dominance sliding further with each passing second as he shifted in his seat. The diners resumed their meals, despite the fact that the atmosphere in the room had changed. The quiet murmur of privilege and pretense had been replaced by a richer experience, a shared understanding, perhaps even respect, for the waitress who had served as a reminder of the power of authenticity. However, Leonard was not only humiliated, he was also exposed, and no amount of charisma could protect him from the truth. Presently, each individual in attendance observed. The weight of the moment settled in Deborah's bosom as she stepped away from the piano. When she returned to her station, her colleagues greeted her with gentle gestures of encouragement and quiet smiles. She still had a task to complete, but her posture had undergone a transformation. Her movements were more deliberate, and her head was held slightly higher. Leonard's table had become considerably more tranquil. Previously, his entourage had chuckled uncontrollably at her expense, however, they now avoided eye contact. The conversation was subdued, and the bravado that had previously characterized their corner of the restaurant had dissipated, leaving only an unsettling silence. Deborah experienced a sense of lightness as the evening progressed. Each step she took through the dining room felt more purposeful, and her confidence blossomed in a manner she had not anticipated. Patrons approached her to express their gratitude as she refilled glasses and removed plates. Deborah sat down with a coffee cup in her hand, and an elderly woman gently remarked, "You are incredible. I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." "Continue," a third individual advised. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Deborah expressed her gratitude with calm humility, her heart swelling with emotion. These were not mere compliments. They were affirmations of her aspirations and the hard work she had put in. Nevertheless, Leonard was not as benevolent. Deborah approached his table to deliver the bill, and he gazed up at her with an expression that oscillated between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "Your argument has been effectively articulated," he stated, his voice becoming strained. "There is no need to further emphasize the point." Deborah halted, gazing directly into his eyes. "It was never about demonstrating anything to you," she replied, her voice remaining composed yet assertive. "I merely desired to engage in a game." Leonard did not respond. His once commanding presence was reduced to an ungainly shuffle as he fidgeted with his drink. Everyone at the table was aware that the power dynamic had completely changed. One of Leonard's companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, gazed at Deborah as he made his signature on the check. He said, "You are amazing." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a brief moment, she observed a glimmer of humanity in a group she had previously dismissed as superficial. "Indeed. I am grateful," she replied, before departing with a modest smile. Leonard and his party departed quietly at the conclusion of the evening, their customary grand exit being replaced by a hasty retreat. Deborah observed them depart without experiencing either triumph or grievance. Leonard was no longer on her consciousness, her attention was already focused on the subsequent action. The tips she received that evening were remarkably generous, providing her with sufficient funds to cover her rent and a small amount additional for piano lessons that she had been postponing. Deborah experienced a sense of assurance that she had not experienced in years as she closed up and walked home, the crisp air filling her lungs. She was not merely a hostess, nor was she merely a dreamer. She was an artist, and no amount of mocking words, financial hardships, or terror could rob her of that. However, her thoughts were not on the conflict of the previous evening as she walked, they were on the future, where her aspirations finally felt more tangible than they had ever been. Deborah's fingers glided over the keys of her ancient upright piano as she sat on the worn bench in her small apartment. The sound was not as sharp or rich as the grand piano at La Fontaine, but it did not matter. The music emanated from her heart, as it had consistently done. She experienced an internal transformation that evening. Not only was it a moment of triumph, but she also came to the realization that her talent was not something she needed to conceal or justify. It was hers, and it sufficed. The events at the restaurant became somewhat of a local narrative in the days that followed. The story was recounted by patrons who had witnessed her performance, and it began to circulate. Deborah received a call a few days later from a Nashville-based music producer who had dined with her that evening. He was not offering her fame or fortune, rather, he was offering her the opportunity to record a demo, which was a step towards a goal she had only dared to imagine. Deborah consented, not because she anticipated that it would transform her life overnight, but because it felt as though a door was opening, and she was unafraid to enter. She had allowed dread and doubt to infiltrate her mind for years, convincing her that she was inadequate and that her aspirations were excessively ambitious. However, she now recognized the reality: her greatest assets were authenticity and resilience. The incident with Leonard Grayson was not merely an ignominious spectacle that evolved into a triumph, it served as a reminder of the importance of integrity. Despite his affluence and confidence, Leonard possessed nothing that could diminish her. She silenced him with nothing but the purity of her craft, as he symbolized every voice of doubt she had ever encountered. Deborah's message was unmistakable to anyone who viewed her narrative: never allow others to determine your worth. The world is replete with individuals who project their insecurities onto others in order to feel powerful. These individuals are known as Leonard Grayson. However, genuine influence is achieved by remaining true to oneself and allowing one's passions to be more influential than their ridicule. Deborah smiled as she closed the piano lid and placed her hands on the weathered wood. Although it was far from over, her journey felt as though it had genuinely begun for the first time. How about you? What ambition have you been failing to pursue due to fear or uncertainty? Do not wait for an individual such as Leonard to put you to the test. Instead, take the first action. If Deborah's narrative resonated with you, consider subscribing to receive additional narratives of triumph and perseverance. Your narrative may be the next to be told.